This is the Cascadia Podcasters Podcast, and I'm Jason Rigden. On today's episode, we have James Pratt of Silent Superheroes. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Jason. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come here and talk with us. Could you tell us just a little bit about your show?
Absolutely. Silent Superheroes is a podcast that tells the stories of people who work with a mental illness. And, the intention of that is to destigmatize mental illness and also help people understand that the people that they work with every day, there's a high probability, a non-trivial number of them have a mental illness that they're managing. And
how long have you been doing this show?
I launched it last November, I think November 27th-ish. It's 2018. And I'd probably been preparing for it since the summer. I think I recorded my first episode in July 2018, give or take.
And how many episodes have you done so far?
I have published 11. My 12th is coming out next week. And I've recorded, I think, 18 or 19 now.
And so what made you decide to use like a podcast for this? Maybe you could do this maybe through like a blog or on YouTube. But what was special about podcasting?
That is a great question. I think telling a story is a very oral thing. It's sort of deep in the human psyche to kind of tell stories to one another. I always think about like going back to the campfire, in our primitive form. And so I think there's just something very human and evocative about hearing somebody tell a story.
And I'm going to guess that you're asking people to really talk about very vulnerable things, and maybe putting a camera on them might be adding a little bit too much to it.
Yeah, I actually have one of my guests, a guy called Reed Tretlin, has a YouTube channel where he interviews particularly men about mental health and mental illness. And so, evidently people are willing to be on camera, but audio is a medium that I like a lot. I think podcasting is a great way to get, sort of get content out there to reach people in a way that's convenient for them, because you can listen to a podcast if you're driving, right? But you probably shouldn't be watching YouTube while driving.
Yes. Yeah. I think I've seen that a few times. It is very scary. And yeah, it is. You do build this very personal relationship with the listener, especially with this kind of stuff. Like it's stuff that they might not, earbuds might help them. So it feels more private.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point.
So what motivated you to actually start this show?
Well, I guess there's a short and a long version of this story. So I'll try and tend towards the short. So, I mean, the first part of the story is I have type 2 bipolar. So bipolar is a mood disorder where my mood can go from, very, very serious clinical depression through to a state of what's called hypomania, which is a very high energy state with lots of focus and creativity and good ideas and, willing to be, take more risks and things like that. And so I've had this kind of personal experience of living with bipolar for probably a large part of my life, although I was only diagnosed in 2014. And I kind of quietly worked with that for a long time, never really talked about it with anybody. And I was doing a coach. I was learning to be a professional coach, and I was doing some peer coaching with somebody in my class. And she worked in HR, and I was talking about how, I was coming out of a period of hypomania, and I could feel myself slipping into depression. I'm exhausted, and it's just like going between these two states all the time is such hard work. And she's like, wow, I'd never heard anybody talk about that before. Like I didn't really know anything about depression or bipolar or what that's like to live with it. And I thought, you work in HR, in employee relations, which is like the part of HR where you work with employees. And I thought, God, you know nothing at all. And I'm not judging her, but I suddenly realized there's just nobody talking about mental health at work specifically. And so that was where the seed got sown. And then 2017, Thanksgiving, a very close friend of mine died by suicide. And I went to her memorial service, and essentially the whole memorial service went by without anybody mentioning mental illness or the depression she lived with. And if I can be really blunt, I was like, this is just bullshit that we're not having a conversation about a topic that is so important and affects so many people. 1 in 4 people in any given year will have some kind of problem with their mental health. Could be diagnosed by a psychiatrist or another mental health professional. And it's so common. I just thought it's so strange that we're not talking about it. And so I decided to start the podcast as my way of contributing to this conversation and kind of getting some of these stories out there.
And had you done any podcasting before this one?
I had done no podcasting at all.
So what were some of the biggest challenges of producing this show?
I'm lucky in that I don't have any fear of like performance or being recorded. I've done all sorts of kind of stuff through my career where I've been on videos and interviewed for things and interviewed people. So that wasn't really too much of a problem. I'm also, because of the professional coaching, I'm very good at asking people questions. So like that part of it didn't seem like it would be too much of a problem. I'm also good at getting people to like open up, in a conversation and just be kind of authentic and talk about personal stuff. So that felt like it would be, that would be fine. I think one of the pieces I feared was getting people who were willing to have the conversation, because it's a very private topic, right? And so I was kind of like, will I do one episode and then like I'll never find anybody else to talk about it again? That was a fear. And then I think on the technical side, I'm a reasonably technical person. I've done video editing and things in the past, not at a high level, but it was just kind of learning the mechanics of recording and then, editing. And I think honestly, it's after I started, I really learned a lot about, recording an episode and how to record it in a way that makes it easy to edit and easy to work with.
Was there any difficulty in, you yourself, like taking to the mic and talking about this stuff? It seems, like you said, very private.
It's a great question. I had been increasingly out over the years prior, just telling more and more people. And I just kind of had a moment of, fuck it, is this an explicit podcast?
Oh yeah, you can say whatever you want.
Oh, good. All right, great.
As long as you're okay with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had this moment of, fuck it, I just have to talk about this stuff. And if I talk about it, it makes it easier for other people to talk about it. And so I just decided that now's the time.
So then what have been the biggest rewards of doing this show?
I think every individual that I talk to, almost always at the end of the conversation, they say, wow, it was just so good to talk about that, because I never get to talk about it. And I never talk about it with other people. So I think just kind of one-on-one that is hugely rewarding. I think, just the kind of, I now get invited to speak on behalf of the mental health community for events. I was at an HR event recently and I was invited to be on the panel there. So I get kind of to go out into the real world and have these conversations as well. And so that was kind of an unexpected privilege that came out of doing this.
Yeah, it's amazing the number of doors that podcasting can open up, especially when you're talking about a very important topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of funny, how quickly people think of me as an expert in this field. And it's like, I've got my personal experiences and I've spoken to like 20 people about it. But then I guess it's a topic where so few people are talking about it that maybe that does make me an expert. I don't know, right?
And so where do you host your podcast episode files?
I host them on Blueberry. So I just got one of their reasonably inexpensive accounts. And
how have you liked them so far?
It's been fine. I think one of the reasons I chose them was because they have the PowerPress WordPress plugin, and my website is built in WordPress, and so it seemed like their integration was really good. Their plugin in WordPress seems, I don't want to say necessarily complicated, but there's just a lot of stuff in it. And so, you don't seem to need to tweak and change too many settings, but there's so many settings that kind of I feared for a while. Like, is there a button I'm not pushing that I should, or a field I'm not filling in, or something like that? But I feel like I got the hang of it.
And what kind of microphone do you use?
I use a Samsung Q2U microphone, and I also have a Blue Yeti that is very popular that somebody gave me, bless them. And I've been experimenting with that, but I think I prefer the sound quality of the Samsung Q2U.
And when you're doing your interviews with guests, are they face-to-face, or are you doing them remotely?
As much as I can, I do them face-to-face. But obviously, there are lots of people that I encounter that I don't get to do face-to-face. And so I right now use Zoom, the meeting platform, which is nice because you can kind of see the person as you're recording. The downside of it is that the frequency of the recordings is a little lower than kind of typical quality. I think it's like 32 kilohertz versus 44.
And then when you're doing the face-to-face interviews, how are you recording those?
So I'm actually in the process of changing, and so I have been using a Behringer. Was it Euphoria UMC? I don't know, 404 HD, which is a like a USB mixer interface, which is nice. It's got four ports. So if ever I were to have a lot of people on the podcast, that would be cool. It's reasonably inexpensive. I want to say it was like $100 or something like that. My issue with it has been that it seems to pick up a lot of noise. And evidently I live in a house that has a ridiculous amount of just ambient EM noise. Like, even if I've literally at one point, I went to the breakers in the garage. I switched off everything like in the house, and there's still EM noise. So it's like, okay, clearly my house is just, I don't know, must have a hidden power station next door or something. I don't know. But so I found the Behringer picked up quite a bit of noise. And so I actually just bought a Zoom recorder. I think it's the H6. And I did that in part because I'm going to do a live version of the podcast soon. And so I bought it for that, so that I could do a test event. I actually did a test event recently as well, just to see how well that worked. And so, of course, I can now just use that to record, in the house, and the EM pickup seems to be a lot better. I mean, it's, but it's like 3 times as expensive. I think it's like $300, not $100.
And then what do you use to edit your episodes?
I use Audacity because it's free. And I think, when you start podcasting, you're not sure if you're going to like it, if you're going to keep doing it. Not spending money is probably a good idea. Audacity works pretty well with the Behringer, over USB. I found that it has a few quirks. One, in fact, that caused me to lose some parts of a recording.
Oh no!
Yeah, I know. Fortunately, it was a very long recording. It was a 3-hour conversation, and I always try and edit down to about 45 minutes. And so I had plenty of content to work with. I might have missed something that was really cool, but at least I could make an episode out of it. But if you don't have like a good quality USB cable, I think that can trip up Audacity. I found that Audacity, if you switch to a browser like Chrome, that can really affect its ability to to record and get enough bandwidth on the recording. And I've also found that if you let your laptop, I use a Mac, if you let it go to sleep and Audacity is running, I've had it a couple of times sort of slightly corrupt a recording, like just drop some data. So my advice is, if you're going to use Audacity, as soon as you're done with something, hit the save button, close Audacity down. And then since I started doing that, I've had no problems at all. And obviously when I'm recording, I just make sure I have nothing else running on the laptop at the same time.
Yeah, there's nothing else worse than losing those recordings. Is that how long you usually do? 3 hours, and you shrink it down to 45?
I don't think my guest would object to me pointing out that that was an interview with somebody with ADHD. So it's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and so our conversation kind of jumped around all over the place a little bit. And so it just kind of took a while to kind of bring all the threads of the conversation back together. Typically, and this is one of the things I've learned, I set 2 hours aside for the conversation, because as there are flubs, and you end up going down these kind of blind alleyways that have no value. And then so I set aside 2 hours, and I used to always hit 2 hours. As I've done it more, I've got better at not asking questions out of my own personal blind curiosity. And I've learned where not to go really deep and where to let like a more surface answer go. And so I've had a few recently where we've recorded for about an hour, and then editing an hour down to 45 minutes is a breeze compared to editing 3 hours down to 45 minutes.
So how long does that post-production usually take you?
This is another area where I've learned over time. So I used to do all the editing myself, and I found that I would spend a lot of time editing out silence and ums and ers and stuff like that. And then in the edit workflow, like I'd like half be concentrating on the story and then half concentrating on editing out all the ums and the ers. So it felt like it was taking me like, I never timed it, but like 20 hours or something of editing, especially for some of those ones that are just absolute monsters. And so what I now do is I send the initial recording off to an audio editor to do a deep clean. So I use a site called Fiverr, Fiverr.com. So it's kind of a gig working site. And so there's this guy I've been working with for a while in Croatia. I send it off to him, and he does all the kind of cleaning of the audio. So he takes out the ums and the rs and the spaces. Now, it costs a little bit of money to do it, but for me, I've got kids, I've got a family, I've got like my coaching job, I've got my full-time job, and it's like, I want to focus on the telling the story, right, and getting the stories out there. I don't need to spend time doing that kind of editing. So that's made it a lot easier, and frankly, just a lot more fun for me.
And so is that person just kind of like cleaning it up, or are they doing any actual like edits?
They're cleaning it up. They will cut out if there's like if there's an obvious side conversation, or like someone goes off to the bathroom or something like that, they'll take that stuff out. But then I'll do from there, I'll do all the editing. So I'll figure out what the content we want to kind of keep and throw away is.
So you still have creative control.
Yeah. And that's super important for me. This is all about stories, and I want to tell the stories. And so like I've held on to that control.
So how do you prepare for your episodes and your guests?
I don't. So I usually know why someone's coming on. Like we've talked about, like, hey, I have, borderline personality disorder. So I know what they're going to talk about. I send them a list of, here's some questions that I might ask during the course of the discussion. But I don't do anything. And I think part of the reason for that is that, one, with the coaching, I'm very used to like really being with somebody in the moment, and kind of, I don't fear whether, a question will come, right? The questions always come because I've just, I've done like, hundreds of hours of coaching. And so I'm just very used to that. And then also I want to be able to experience it like a listener will experience it, like for the first time. And so that's why I don't do any meaningful prep.
So then the guest kind of guides you along.
Yeah, I know what the story structure is. Like it's a 3-act thing. Mm-hmm. It's kind of person's background and how they came to find that they had a mental illness. Act 2 is kind of their journey to learn how to manage it and live with it. And then Act 3 is their work, their experience at work, and ways that work could be, better evolved to support them in some way. And so I know what the broad structure is. And so it's then just about, asking questions within that structure.
Yeah, just kind of winding your way through the kind of these almost like checkpoints, maybe.
That's it. Exactly. Yeah.
And so how do you find your guests?
It's the one thing, as I said, I feared that I wouldn't find people. And I've really been surprised by how many people have willingly come forward. My very first guest, my wife walks the dog of my first guest. And she had mentioned like, oh, my husband's, starting up this podcast. And then it turned out this woman was bipolar. And she's like, I'll do it. I'll come on the podcast. Second guest was like a friend, somebody I'd known for years. He was the person who really helped me understand what depression was. And then from there, what's happened is as people I know have heard the podcast, have heard that I'm doing it, they've connected me up with other people that they know who may have a mental illness or like work in that space. And so it's been surprisingly easy. One of my guests, I mentioned a panel that I did at an HR conference, and she came up to me afterwards and she's like, I have this mental illness and, can I get on the podcast? And we literally recorded an episode later that day. So it's, I guess in summary, it's been word of mouth. And I talk about the podcast a lot. Like sometimes I feel like I'm just, I'm a broken record. Like I'm just constantly like, hey, I'm James. I do a podcast. Not quite that bad, but and so that's a lot of people come out of the woodwork, that way because I'm just willing to talk about it a lot.
Do you have any advice for doing interviews like these that are kind of, private or very sensitive subjects? You need a lot of empathy to do this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think, listen, I think with anyone who's talking about something that's personal and private, giving them the space to talk is so important. If they're sharing something personal, you don't need to fix it or try and change it. Just acknowledging it, I think, is really important. I also think you'll know if you're the kind of person who, for no obvious reason, like strangers tell you their life story, there's something about you that like people respond to. And so I think if you're the kind of person who, is the kind of agony aunt for all your friends, you're probably going to be good at doing something, a podcast, on a sensitive topic. If you feel personally really awkward if people talk about personal stuff, I would find a different podcast to do.
And do you send when you're done with the recording and the editing and everything, do you send the finished file to your guests before you publish it?
Yeah, I do. As I get more efficient, I'm able to send it to them earlier. So like, for example, I have an episode going out next Tuesday. And today's Thursday. I sent the person the episode this Tuesday, so they get like a week to listen to it. And I don't do it because I'm kind of giving them any kind of editorial, options. Although if they come back and say, "Oh my God," like I'd be mortified if that was out there. Of course, I would do that, but it's more as a courtesy, so they know, what's going to be out there from the recording. And usually the first version I sent doesn't have my voiceovers. So it's just kind of the music and, the conversation. And then usually the voiceovers get done a little later. And so I try and send a final MP3 over to them with the whole voiceover in it as well.
And do you think, does that help at all? Do you tell them beforehand that, you'll be able to hear the finished product before the general public does?
I would say I'm inconsistent about doing that.
Okay.
But, I try to. And of course, some people ask because they want to know. And I think it's courtesy, especially with a topic like this, to let someone hear what's going to be out there.
Yeah. I think it built a certain amount of trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I never want somebody to feel like this is some kind of sensational hatchet job that I'm doing on their life. Right. I mean, I think the hardest one I've had so far was with a woman who has anxiety and PTSD as a result of being raped when she was, I think, 15. And that was one I did not want to kind of get wrong. I didn't want to kind of, in any way make it kind of, it's like kind of offensive or, bluntly kind of as a man in particular, like to say the wrong thing, because it's an experience that, men are extremely unlikely, to have. But she was very happy with what happened. And, she shared it with a whole bunch of people in her circles, which was great. But certainly that was the one I, was the toughest so far.
Do you have any advice for folks that, are thinking about maybe starting a show, or maybe they've, their show's brand new?
One piece of advice, a simple thing, is learn to silently listen to people. So, Jason is doing a great job. Like, he's not saying, yeah. And the first few podcasts I did, there were parts that were painful to listen to because, I naturally do what you do in conversation, which is just to, let people know you're listening, but it really sounds really bad. I think a lot of people say, like, oh, come up with the idea for your podcast and then kind of just do it and see what happens and throw a bunch of, episodes out there. And I get why people say that, because you want to lower the barrier and you want to make sure that you're evolving over time so that, your idea gets more crisp. But I also think it's kind of offensive to someone listening to your podcast, not to do some sensible editing on it, or to not, to not really have an idea of what you're going to talk about. It's like, hey, we're going to talk about podcasting microphones, but then like not have thought about what kind of things do we want to talk about. So I would say, I guess, that maybe wasn't clear, but like, do have an idea, I think, of what the structure of your podcast, is. Be really clear about what, the topic you're trying to cover and what you're trying to get across is, and then be flexible to changing that over time, if that particular model turns out not to work too well for you.
Yeah, you really need to kind of a plan and do your research. Like, it sounds like when you started, you had a plan and you knew the direction you wanted to go.
Oh yeah, very, it was very clear, about it. And there are mental health podcasts out there, although most of them focus on one particular condition. And there are no podcasts I could find that specifically focus on mental health at work. So I kind of found an area. And then I had to think about, okay, what do I want to do? Well, I'm a storyteller. I love hearing people's stories. I love telling people stories. And so that was just a natural fit for me. And the sort of podcast is very much an expression of who I am.
Yeah. And also it sounds like you really, you have a connection to these people when you're talking to them. Just hearing you talk about your guests, that's another thing. You really need that kind of, the word is often overused, but that passion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If it's not something you get excited about, it's unlikely that you're going to get other people excited. So like if you're doing a podcast and intellectually it makes sense, it's like, intellectually, I know that there's no other podcasts out there that deal with mental health at work, but you don't care about mental health. It's not going to work.
Mm-hmm. It's going to show through.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you care about podcasting, right? You have this podcast, you're getting podcasters to meet up. Like when you and I first met, it was on a panel about podcasting. And like, clearly it's something you really care about. And so, that's why this works.
Yeah, it's a strange obsession. It's yeah. So
nothing strange about it, my friend.
So how much time do you think you spend promoting your show?
Oh, that's a tricky one. One, I would say I don't know. I'm not convinced I'm very good at promoting my show. I have a kind of list of things I try and do. For each episode. So, I have a mailing list, make sure I get it out there. I have social media, make sure I get it out there. There are a number of mental health Facebook groups that, I try and post on. I post on some Reddit mental health groups, although not as consistently as I should. There are some, like private HR mailing lists I'm on. So I try and kind of push out a message to that. So I don't know, all told, maybe an hour or two per episode. And then I try and recycle through social media to resurface old episodes as well, right? So that they're constantly, constantly hopefully being found by more people.
And have you found that any channels are more effective than others?
I haven't really found a good way of tracking where listeners are coming from at this point. So I honestly don't know. I mean, I can tell you that, most of my listens come through iTunes, but I don't know how people are finding me on iTunes, right?
Yeah. I always ask because, as podcasters, we hear a lot about you got to promote yourself more and more and more. But for a lot of us, we're into the creative process, and then the selling it is very challenging.
Yeah. I've been working with somebody recently, actually, who was introduced to me by one of my guests, and she has been doing a little bit of work helping me with the social media side of things, and that has seemed to be helping. Again, because as you say, like I'm not someone who is on social media all the time. Like, it's just not my jam. So having somebody in there who just kind of knows what to do and, where the, frequency that we should be putting posts out and things like that, that's been helping a little, and I'm lucky enough to have a little bit of, income that I can just kind of throw in that direction to do something that I don't want to do. I know that's not, obviously necessarily true for everybody. But again, it's like you say, I can focus on the creative part and then just get a little help doing some of the stuff I'm not so good at.
And do you keep up much at all with like the podcast industry news at all?
No, I probably should.
That's what everyone says. Everyone says this. I just talk to people who sometimes, they do newsletters about podcasting and stuff, or, they do a podcast about podcasting. And, they think that every podcaster is really, really paying attention to all of this stuff. And I'm like, no one I listen to is. Yeah.
I mean, I think I learned from listening to podcasts. Like, I get kind of ideas about like, oh, I kind of like the way that was done or that was handled, or, and I look at where, like, how am I finding out about podcasts? Do you know what I mean? How are new ones getting surfaced to me? So I kind of pay attention in that way, but not to the industry trends and what people are talking about.
Well, it's like, with writing, they say, you need to read a bunch in order to become a good writer, and podcasting is no different.
Yeah.
So do you listen to that many podcasts yourself?
I listen to some. I do find that because, when I'm editing an episode, I end up listening to my own episode 6 times or something. That's, dampened my enthusiasm for listening to other people's podcasts. But yeah, I mean, there's a handful there's a handful that I enjoy and I try and listen to.
And so how do you discover new shows?
Usually it's a show by somebody that I, like a kind of a celebrity or like a comedian that I like, that I then find out has a podcast. Bizarrely, I found that since I started doing a podcast, when people know I do a podcast, they then recommend podcasts to me. That happened just this weekend. Somebody was like, "Oh, you'd love this." Like, what is it? I forget what it's called, but it's a podcast about by 2 British guys. It's a comedy podcast, and they read passages from the erotic novel that one of their dads wrote, and then just like talk smack about it. So, sounds great. I'm going to listen to it.
Well, how can people find your show?
I think the easiest way is to go search for Silent Superheroes wherever you get podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, most of the big services. If you can't find it there, go to silentsuperheroes.com.
Well, thank you so much for your time today and coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.